Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and guess what? My friend Thomas J. Oord is here, and we got a whole bunch of big God questions we're going to be talking about. So, Tom, w- how does it feel? How does it feel to be the person people intentionally send questions about God to? Do you?
It feels daunting. Feels like they are just starting to setting us up, trying to trap us,
Well,
stump the chump kind of thing.
yeah. Well, you have a new book coming out.
I do.
What is it? I can't. You put out so many books. It's hard to keep up.
Well, this is an intro to open and relational theology. It's called Open and Relational Theology: An Introduction to Life-Changing Ideas, and it's the kind of book that you can give your mother and she would understand it, even if she doesn't have a degree in theology. Um, so it's written really in a plain language. At the conclusion, there's resources if you want to go deeper, but it basically explains the core concepts of open relational thought, and along the way talks about some of the differences within the open relational community over certain ways of thinking about things. And actually, you show up three times in this book, Ord.
Ooh.
So you show up at the end in the scholar section of Going Deeper. So your name is listed there. Then you also, I don't know if you call this in the book, at the very conclusion, there are some pictures of recent publications from Sacra Sage. And so your divine self investment is listed. And then you are on the back cover as one of the
Yeah.
podcasters endorsing this thing.
Mhm.
So thanks for that. I appreciate it.
Well, Tom, I didn't have to lie. I the and you won't be surprised to hear this that Tom's chapter on love, the Amore chapter, was high quality, and so when you give it to your grandmother, I guess as Tom suggests, then you can just tell her in advance, be like, chapter 4. That's when I thought of you the most, Grandma.
There you
Yeah.
go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have a stack of questions, and I was messaging with a number of people and that have been in some of our previous classes, and I said, "Well, what's the question that you most often get as when people find out you're into like process thought or open relational thought?" And then there became a small game of sending derogatory tweets that they had received. And so I was like, this is high quality, big God question material, because I just thought to myself, I really feel like Tom should just address these because you like answering questions and you write books for normal people. So I feel like you will resolve all this with ease and probably lure some people over, you know?
I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Yeah. I definitely won't coerce anyone.
That's good. That's good. I don't I don't know exactly how you coerce people on a podcast,
I'm not sure
um,
either.
but you
I'm
lean
not sure how
close to
you
the mic.
coerce them at any point. I mean,
Yeah,
part of the point is that God can't coerce and we can't either. But yeah, I get your point.
yeah. But if I lean close to the microphone like this, Tom, do you want to go to hell? I hope not.
Ooh,
Then you should like Marjorie Suhaki more. See? What about that? Do you feel coerced?
that's not bad. Or it reminds me of the pastor who typed out his sermon and then decided to go through and make marks in the margins to sort of help him to emphasize things. And he wrote in the margins at one point, "Weak point, yell louder."
All right. Okay. So the first derogatory tweet um, that was nominated, they upvoted as very popular response once
Oh,
on
okay.
on
This
the
is
Twitter when they
serious.
find out about the process people is
Yeah.
look, Process deities are impotent. I don't even know why you want to use the word God. Can we really trust God's going to do whatever God says God's going to do when God can't even make a person saved? Question mark.
Yeah, this has got to be the most common criticism. You got a weak God, impotent God. I coined a new word while writing this new book that I mentioned earlier. I was thinking about omnipotence and impotence, and one is God does everything or could do everything, and impotence is this is a God who does nothing. He's just a weakling. And I coined the word amipotence. Ami meaning love, potent meaning strength. So there's a lot of ways to answer that objection to process thought, but my favorite way is to say, if we start with God's love, then we think about God's power in a different kind of way. It can't be a controlling kind of power. Now, there's still lots of questions that are left open, but if you start from the point of love, I think some of the concerns people have with process thought begins to dissipate. Secondly, I like to point out that when process folks say God doesn't control everybody, the alternative isn't God watching us, up on Jupiter, twiddling his thumbs as if God's uninvolved. I think process thought presents a God who's thoroughly involved, moment by moment, everything in every moment, complex to small. So, in some ways, this God is more powerful if you think that being involved in the world is a form of power. So there's two things to start off with. How about you, Tripp? How would you respond?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is what is the background image of God you start with, right?
Yeah,
And so the base criticism of all the different open relational theologies and process, specifically Whitehead names it, is that our image of the divine, kind of the unexamined assumptions of what's entailed in a deity, have been occupied by a vision that is closer to the one who builds crosses than the one who bears them. Right. This is
yeah,
the end of Process and Reality, Whitehead's book. He basically goes like, there's a lot of different visions of God in the world. You got the one obsessed with morals, you got the one obsessed with power, then you got the philosophical omni God, and then you have the Galilean vision, right? Like the loving servant, where that seeks the flourishing of the whole. Anyway, like I think so often, if your vision of can God do anything is one of those older visions, then it's like, does God hold the wrong, those who do bad, accountable? Right. And
yeah,
Whitehead's like, God's a little bit oblivious as to morals. Right? Or like you need like the omni God. You're like, well, perfection entails such. So therefore, and you start listing out all
yep,
the Greek kind of visions of perfection. Um, or like, like God's like the cosmic lawgiver, and then you got to go set things right because something's infringed upon. Like whatever these background images are set up for how you envision power. And so like when you become or awaken to the fact you've always been an open and relational theologian, then your background image is not one where God's power is demonstrated precisely by showing up where God wasn't and forcing the situation to be how God demands it. um,
mm,
God's power is something that always exists, always active, always
yeah,
present. So then the question is, in what ways can the desire for God become more active, more animating, more expressed in any moment? And for
right,
especially when you think of like um, when you think of in a kind of classical process vision of metaphysics, like every event, God is present. God is
right,
involved in every event prior.
and not
That
just watching. I mean,
yeah,
actually influencing.
right. That's why when you're like, well, God's impotent, you're like, no, no, no. God's been involved in the whole thing and promises to still be involved in the whole thing later. The question is, like, in what is the image of power that you
Yeah,
desire to be more than impotent? And if your vision is one that bears crosses and doesn't build them, if your vision is one that comes alongside, like the paraclete, let's say, right? Like there's so many biblical images of how, well, I don't know, one that chooses to covenant with you because you're a genuine other. right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
many of the biblical images are relational images, and God's self-expression happens in the reciprocal relationship of a covenanted people, or I don't know, the incarnate one, right? Whatever. There are all these
Right.
images. And so like when people say impotent, I just think, well, Caesar's editors are still tinkling behind the
Yeah.
scenes. But
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
what
there's another side of this that I've been thinking about lately, and your mentioning of your image of God jogged this in my head. I think some people think of God as a parent, a loving parent, and we as God's children as 1-year-olds. Now, when you're a 1-year-old and you're trying to be a loving parent to 1-year-old, man, you do a lot of things for them, and you scoop them up and you keep them from uh, I don't know, crawling into a bunch of red ants or whatever. And so you think of the parent as really, if not controlling, at least there to rescue you if things got out of hand. I have 3 daughters, and they're all in their 20s now. And I tell you, as a father of 3 20-year-olds, it's just a whole different ballgame. Not only can I not stop them from crawling into red ants if they want to, but I have to think really carefully about the way I want to try to persuade them toward what I think is good and helpful and loving. Um, and many people don't realize that when Jesus and New Testament writers talked about adopting children, they weren't adopting 1-year-olds. They were adopting people in their teens and 20s, people who had significant agency. So I think that might help us too, Tripp, to think about if God's a parent, what kind of children are we? Are we children that need to have our diapers changed? Or are we children who are partners with God?
do you think part of that of uh it like my pastoral response when I hear that is it usually thinks something like this. Um how one makes meaning out of their deepest pains or struggles
Mm,
under the terms of classical theism
mm,
is to call those experiences, pains, and struggles good from God's
yeah,
perspective. And God, in some way, is the author,
right.
permitter, or whatever, right, of it. And so when you first encounter something like an open and relational perspective, or like Whitehead's like fellow sufferer who understands, you're like, whoa, like before, I at least had the recourse, right? That while it didn't feel this way, it really is God's will.
Yeah,
Or yeah, and 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 so sometimes that hesitancy, I think, is because like it opens back up um the way you in a different theological perspective manage to make sense out of real pain, suffering, struggle,
yeah.
and such. And so
That's a
I just
great
think it's
point.
important to notice that, even though I then want to go like, yeah, okay, so you learn from that process that you use that theological idea, and I may not agree with it, but a lot of times turns out those people are nicer than their deity.
Yeah,
And
right.
that's when I'm like, can't you come on, come on. Like, but I do think that pastoral thing is, or it's not pastoral in the sense I mean, that's where I gained it, but like the
Yeah.
human thing, like a
Well, and
lot
let
of
me,
times people debate theology without realizing you're also debating how you interpret the the best and worst moments of your life.
yes, what you like to call the existential register. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah, I I like what you said. Let me come at it from not so much a pastoral thing, but a philosophical theologian, which
hmm
I'm also that. If you look at the people who write philosophical theology and God's power, they make so many qualifications. They'll embrace divine omnipotence and say that it's at the core of who God is, and then they'll start just making qualification after qualification. This God can't do what's illogical. This God can't change the past. This God can't contradict the God's own nature. Maybe in some cases, this God can't take away free will. In some cases, this God doesn't literally have all the power. And by the time all those qualifications are put out there by professional philosophers of religion, the word omnipotent just doesn't isn't the right word. And so you don't have to be a process person to realize the problems with omnipotence.
No, you don't. You don't. And you don't have to. Just like if you just survey people that leave behind one of the monotheistic faiths that's like their main reason.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
experiences that it qualifies evil, followed by rankant hypocrisy.
Yep.
Um, and anyway, all right. So the next one is hold on. There we go. Oh, what were you gonna say?
I was going to say we're going to have to go. I'm going to have to make my answers shorter if we're going to get through these.
We don't have to do a lot of them.
Okay. Okay.
We'll do the right number.
All right. There you
Okay.
go.
Look, process God is just an evolving God. What do you need to worship an evolving God for? What if God evolves into something that's not even worthy of worship?
Yeah. This one I hear quite a bit, and I
Well,
think
good, because
people.
Twitter agrees with you. Like,
This one, I think what people hear is they see a God who's moved, who changes, who's mutable, and so they think, oh, well, that means this God is not steadfast. Um, and and on my good days, when I'm giving people the best interpretation, I suspect many of them want something secure to hold on to. Maybe they think life has already got a lot of change, and we need something or someone who's rock solid that's you can rely on. And I get that. I'm that way too. Um, what they don't understand is that process people and open relational people have a pretty sophisticated view they call dipolar theism. I have some my own names, but that's the most common one. And it says that God's nature or essence is steadfast, unchanging, eternally the same. But God's experience is what changes or evolves, to use the word we're using here. And so, yeah, there is real change in God, but not God's nature. God's a real experiencing individual. And so I think we got the best of both worlds in that. We got a God whose nature is steadfast and a God whose experience is flexible.
mhm. Yeah, and it, every time I hear this, I always just think, wouldn't it have been better if instead of process philosophy, it was like philosophy of organism that stuck, right? Because
Interesting.
which was Whitehead's like preferred term.
Right.
He used philosophy of organism better because an organism, like it, it if it's not changing, it's dead, right?
Right.
So, like part of life is the ongoing fluctuation of change because life only exists in relationships. It's only in the context, a social context, or a web of relations that life exists. It's
Yeah.
not something that exists in a vacuum. And so when God, whether, there's open relational theologians that will argue all night long about the creation out of nothing or co-eternal or series of whatever, like, but all of them agree that the God world relationship in the present is the fruit of God and the world relating to each other.
Right. Yeah.
And the life of God and the life of the world can't be understood apart from each other. And that's not to relativize the life of God or the life of the world. It's to recognize that the identity of both requires the actual relations of both. So that means you end up in like if you're doing religion science stuff, you're trying to articulate the way in which the principle of possibility that's structured across a whole host of different disciplines coheres with your metaphysical picture, right? Where this principle of limitation of all the possibilities towards what's generative and in cultivating greater depth of subjectivity in relations, that something like that's reflective of a deep teleological desire that we in religious circles will use something like God. But that also means when you're thinking about on the flip side, that means that actual relationship, if we look at the history of evolution or the history of the cosmos, that it's not just that God's mind-like investment in that relationship is revelatory. It also means that life that God has had with the world has shaped God But that doesn't mean God is deficient.
Right.
Right? Like some things increase because of relationships that don't necessitate you looking back and going, well, it was inefficient before. And I think like that move where if there's change, it's either for the better or worse, it then problematizes both sides. That move just doesn't work for actual living things in an organism.
Right.
Things don't.
Right.
Your kid, I mean, you gave the kid example. They grew to maturity, right? Like you, you talked about how you're going to be a grandfather again. Like there's nothing when you hold your grandkid where you go like, I really wish I was still changing your mother's diapers. But you love changing her diaper. You wasn't a failure in that relationship. And the fruit of
Right.
the relationship is her trusting you to get to go on a date with her partner so you can then play with your grandkid all alone. And that's called
Yep.
winning. But that means,
Well, and
there's that reciprocal opening.
yeah, and I like the way you're going. And let me bring up the relationship that you have with Alicia and I have with Cheryl, my wife. I mean, can you imagine what it would be like if our spouses didn't change whatsoever? That our relationship was not one of mutual giving and receiving. If they were just like stony statues, I mean, it would just suck. A real love relationship is one in which someone gives and receives, in which you learn, in which you grow and develop over time. So that fits your organism illustration also very well.
In one sense, the question is, what are you evolving towards? And if it's the infinite God of love that's a part of the fluctuating movement of history,
Mm-hmm.
God shows up as the God of love, uh, giving the invitation to evolve towards that very life of God. Like, uh, so I, I don't know. I don't quite get it. And even I occasionally respond to people like this on Twitter, and then I find that I get frustrated too quick, and sarcasm and genuine care doesn't get communicate when I text. So I back out. But
uh,
I'm always sitting there going like, well, w- the unevolving God, like, just sounds like the parent, at least as a youth minister, I had the hardest time like dealing with, like the one
yeah,
where like, can't you recognize that she's 17 and going to go to college in a year? And if you keep acting like she's 3, she's not going to want to come home.
right.
Like the not changing parent. Like, um, anyway, if philosophy of organism could have helped, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you.
But who knows? Who knows? All right, here's a fun one. Uh, can a process theologian really believe in the inspired word of God? I don't think so, because who knows what God is in the Bible and how you even read it if everything's just all flux and change all the time. I mean,
I like the way you read that.
I,
Before I answer that, let me plug a new book that's coming out, well, June 22nd by a guy named Gabriel Gordon on this exact issue, the inspiration of Scripture from an open and relational perspective. I think it's something like The God Who Speaks or something like that. Anyway, so that, whoever it is, you want to go deeper on this subject, check out that new book. Yeah. So, is the Bible inspired? Well, if you mean by that, did God pre-decide and make sure every single last portion of the Bible was exactly what God wanted? No, I don't. Can't think of any process people. I know of one openist person who used to believe the Bible was inerrant, and then that fell apart. Because the problem is we don't have the original text, and there's also real contradictions within the Bible itself. Not only contradictions, or um, at least tensions between the contemporary world we live in, science, history, etc., but real contradictions in what biblical passages say. So the question is, what's the nature of inspiration? That's the real question. And I think an open relational person will want to say God really does reveal. God really does act in ways to give insights, intuitions, messages, feelings, all these kinds of things, but not in a controlling kind of way. And therefore, we have a text that isn't always consistent. And the sooner people realize that, I think the better they are in understanding the Bible. How would
Mhm.
you respond, Tripp?
I guess two things. One, just like I, let's put it this way, like every event, both the history behind whatever the text is, its composition, and every time it's read aloud and interpreted, is an event where God has desires, and those desires are more or less participated with based on the openness and availability and fidelity of
And
the creatures.
understanding.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. So, like the idea that um an open and relational or process perspective eliminates divine inspiration when the metaphysic is basically like every event's inspired by God,
Right.
right? So then the question is, in what, like, how do you understand the way that Scripture functions authoritatively?
Yeah.
Um, um, I mean, a quick way of putting it would just be like this: the the stories we tell dramatically shape the stories we live, and this is true about how you process your own story, right? You could tell the story of your family, your marriage, your friends, and then which elements, which figures, like how you feel about something, or which things you crystallize as this is the person I love on their best day, and this is who they really are. All that, which the story you tell dramatically shapes the one you live, and so much so that a lot of therapists spend a lot of time helping people just retell the story with the
Right.
exact same facts, right?
Yep.
And so, I I mean, when I think of the power in which narratives shape the one that is being lived, then I think as Christians, open and relational Christians, we're saying something like the story of God and Israel and the story of the one we call the Christ and the ongoing life of the church is deeply formed by the story we keep telling and retelling.
Yes.
And that, like, there's hardly anything more. There's not another kind of a deeper affirmation humans give than by this is my story, and or this is my song praising my anyway. But it,
I love it.
but when you think of inspiration not
Yep.
as something you say with this type of detachment where you go like, oh, that's authoritative or that's inspired, and you're like pointing at it as an object. But if
Yeah.
inspiration is a kind of enactment, if it's a kind of if what you're affirming as the inspired word of God, the authority of Scripture, it's actually nested in your own life as a disciple in the
Yep.
community of the faithful, and in that way the story you're telling is the one you're living. I don't.
I like the way you put that. When you were explaining your vision, I got to thinking about the kind of person who probably asked this question and made this statement. And because I have lots of friends in my life who kind of come with this scripture stuff in this kind of way, and typically they're people who want to believe that the Bible they hold in their hands is somehow dictated or made put there by God in a kind of sovereign way. That's the word they would use. And of course, once you start examining that by comparing not only the translations of Scripture, but also the discrepancies in the earliest manuscripts, some of the more thoughtful ones will say, yeah, but what we really inspired was those autographs, those original manuscripts. Of course, we don't have any of those. And then I just think, well, that is just like the stupidest thing. I mean, can you imagine if you said something like, "I have a systematic theology that has all truth, and the reason I know it has all truth is because it was given directly by God." And you said, "Really? Let me read it." And you said, "Well, I don't have it with me. It's a mouse has it on Mars right now. But let me tell you, it's exactly what God wants." I mean, that does us no good. So we still have to function with the Bibles we have. And because those Bibles not only are translated in such vastly different kinds of ways, but even the oldest manuscripts we have real differences. In fact, some whole stories just left out of the oldest ones. We
Mhm.
need to be more humble when we talk about what it means for the Bible to be inspired and how we should interpret it.
Well, The flip side of this, and I know, this question probably was not coming from a liberal mainline Protestant side, but if you do, like the open relational perspective is also that it's not just some random historical text among others, right?
Good
Like
point.
the reason, and I'll put it this way: I think there's a slight phobia because we're at a point in church history where um, we have cultivated a kind of historical consciousness and are aware of our place in history and the way in which
Right.
culture and stuff shapes it. We're aware of the way culture and society and institutions do this. And then we're coming to grips with a whole host of problems, from racism, sexism type stuff to ecological crisis, to then, like, what have we signed up for with our with the agenda of our technology and economy? Like, there's so many ways in which we start to ask the kind of questions that, like, we get a kind of vertigo, and then it cultivates a kind of suspicion towards any structure. And so
Yeah.
the impetus, I think, for liberal Protestants is like Protestantism on steroids, where you as an individual have to have worked through and figured out everything in order for you to parse it through your filter. And so a lot of mainline Protestant ministers, and I've been talking with quite a few of them recently in a class, like, have this, like, well, I don't know, I haven't really thought through this, maybe we don't need a prayer of confession, or I'm not sure about the Trinity at baptism. And all of these are like signals of, like, I don't know if I can trust this tradition, and yet I'm ordained in it. And like, like, whatever that piece is where you are now the arbiter of everything. But I think an open relational view is one where you have to go something like, you're a part of this tradition, you've decided to be a part of it, it's remain in it. And that's because God is always working in the best way God can, in whatever context it is, with whatever ways our ears might be open, right? And
Yeah.
the part of our identity as the church is that we have historically, through the life of the church, identified particular testimonies. We said we can't be Gentiles without the story of Israel, right? As a church, we've said that these gospels that don't even agree on what day Jesus died are trustworthy testimonies of the risen Christ, right? Like, think of, like, and so I think
Yeah.
part of the pushback, an open relational perspective says, yes, every event, every history, every text, every interpretation is human, but everything is also a place where God was present, working, and active for the beauty, love, and desire
Nice
of God.
summary.
So how do
Yeah.
we honor both? And I think for more conservative Christians, inspiration is an activity God does with humans, so you can't sterilize it. But for more
Yeah.
progressive ones, it means, yeah, God used some stupid people from our perspective that were backwards, and they did.
Yeah.
And you're in that tradition. So how do you honor them? How do you receive it? How do you challenge it, but not throw everything? Anyway, they're different
Yeah.
tasks each.
Beautiful. I like it.
The oh, here's one. And this one you told me when I told you the topic,
Okay.
that open relational theology is just philosophy, not theology. And I
Yeah.
was like, I haven't heard this, because
Really.
I think we have different friends. I mean, I know we have some really cool same ones, but if someone was like, Tripp, I don't know, that's just philosophy, it's not even theology, I'd be like, really? Because my friends on philosophy faculty are pretty sure it's theology, but I'll take that as a compliment.
I don't know if I ever told you that about 10 years ago, a collection of scholars in my tradition wrote a whole book of essays bashing process theology. And I heard that it was going to be, in the works, published by our denominational press. So I asked if I could have a rejoinder. So I read through all of the essays, give a rejoinder at the end. And really stupid, probably politically, but you get the point. And this was one of the criticisms amongst these chapters, that open relational theology is really just a philosophy that you sprinkle in a little bit of Jesus and you say you run from there. And I think there's part of this criticism that is true insofar as there are certain ideas that are at the core of process, I'll say open relational thought, that one could embrace and be a Muslim, have no religious tradition, be Jewish. I mean, there are some of these ideas that transcend any one particular tradition. But those of us who are Christian have found this particular way of thinking not just reasonable, but it fits really well with the broad reading of Scripture. It fits really well with
Mm.
the kind of piety we have and the experiences we have.
Do you
And
think that's
so,
also true about Middle Platonism? Right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I when you say that, in my head, I think, yeah, like obviously, and right, wouldn't you tier it where it's like everyone has a philosophy or metaphysic? It's like, is it
yeah,
examined or not? Then, like when it's examined, then there's like really cool versions that have engaged almost every philosophy, right? Like,
yeah.
um,
Well,
uh,
sometimes I put it this way. I say Roman Catholicism is just an Aristotelian philosophy. And then everybody goes, oh, no, 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 no. Thomas did this, Thomas did that. I think, well, yeah, Thomas took the basic ideas from Aristotle, then fleshed them out in a Christian vision. Um, is there that much difference between taking an open relational vision, which I think is a whole lot more biblical than the Aristotelian one, and fleshing that out? I mean, we're all going to have a philosophy, as you just said. Um, anyhow, I interrupted
no, well, no, no, no. I was only asking like if you think there's a difference because, like, you know how Augustine used the image of the gold in Egypt as
you. I don't
like
remember
how he
that.
used how he used philosophy. So like when the Egyptians are leaving, you know, they go take all this gold, and he goes like, "There's nothing wrong with like taking the gold, like you know, the philosophy, someone else's philosophy, like that
Yeah.
wasn't a Christian. It's just like you don't make ball statues with it." Right. Like so when you melt it down and use it, the question is for what ends. And I think like if you read Augustine closely, you can tell that like historian confessions make sense, right? He goes through like and then he's dealing with a kind of Platonism and working it through with the deep confessional commitments of the church. And then it's shaped by the two big pastoral challenges he dealt with, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
it and you could just say, oh, this is just Jesus flavored Platonism, or you could say like he was a brilliant creative thinker who was deeply convicted like as a minister, and came to his faith that the image of the invisible God was present in Jesus, and it's a brilliant philosophical thinker, wanted to like work through the inheritance of these texts and also the wisdom, the best wisdom that was existing in his time, and then using it practically as a minister. And so sometimes if you have the wrong enemy, um like the Donatists, you end up having bad ideas. And anyway,
Yeah.
you know,
Let
but
me let,
does that
go
make
ahead.
sense? Like
It does.
I
Yeah.
feel like they're like the whatever the distinction you're making in that question, you may say more about what it is, but like, it's philosophy, not theology. Like, you gave the Aquinas example, Augustine's another. You could go with the Cappadocians, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Well,
I'm always worried about the people that think they don't have one.
that's what I was going to say. Everybody has one. Here, let me pick on some contemporary people. I won't name names, but I'll name movement. There is considerable interest these days in something called canonical theology.
Oh,
And when I engage people in this particular tradition, they want to say, well, our theology arises from the canon, as if, the rest of us don't have the Bible or something. And by canonical theology, they want to exclude these philosophical speculations that aren't there in the text. And I just think, oh, you're operating with a philosophy. It's just, maybe you don't see it. The rest
mm-hmm.
of us oftentimes see it. And I can see it many times in the way they interpret particular passages. For instance, one of my friends who's a leading canonical theologian insists on creation out of nothing. And I say, well, if you're a canonical theology and you take the Bible seriously, creation out of nothing isn't in the Bible. Oh, no, 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 no. So we argue back and forth. So everyone's got a philosophy. Best to have a consistent one. And think about God and the things you think are most important, which in the Christian tradition are a host of things that you and I work through in our Apostles' Creed podcast, and then just be honest about this. At least that's how I think about
Yeah, every time someone says creedal, canonical, or whatever, like, I have a hard time differentiating that label from the way in which those labels are used to make sweeping dismissals of people that genuinely care and are invested, right? Like,
it. Yeah.
I mean, okay, you and I have enough minority opinions. I don't think we ever think our academic or people in the pews next to us are going to be like, "Wow, you know what? That's it. Tom and Tripp, they're right." Like, I'm never anticipating this happening, but like, when your position functions as just a conversation starter, like stopper, where, well, I'm a canonical, or I'm a creedal Christian, or I'm a biblical
Yeah.
Christian, whatever you're
Yeah.
Christian, and from that you get to then bear false witness against everyone that disagrees with you. But like, the problem, and obviously we aren't going to get to every Twitter dismissal, but I constantly run it, and I'm like, what? Why are you tweeting about process theology when it's not even clear you've read 2 sentences of it? Right. So I had
Yeah.
the other day, I accidentally responded, and someone went and said, I hate
Accidentally respond. That's
yes,
funny.
I hate process theology because there's no way, Tom. And I always say to myself, look, there's a lot of ways to get every theology to engage another theology, but there's no way a process theologian could also be a liberation theologian, let alone
What?
a black liberation theologian. And I was like,
How in the
have you
world?
Googled the phrase process black liberation? I'm
I mean,
interested.
there are some things people might say that process has a hard time being, but that one, I don't get that at
Oh,
all.
yeah. After a few responsive tweets, Tom, I found out that the only real way you can stick it to oppressive domination systems, get this, by being a traditional Orthodox Christian, because then your omni deity is a real alternative and can judge them. And
Oh, I see.
yeah, and I was just like, you can't be serious, right? And I was like, literally, like, the once the church, I was like, I'm about to sound Baptist, I know, but once the church occupied the halls of authority that crucified people, they've been running shotgun for every empire since then. You cannot tell me that the theological conclusions that were sanctioned in these pretty buildings funded by the Roman Empire and henceforth are like the only option we have to stick it to the man and look for liberation. Like, this is just nuts. And I'm like, you couldn't have like just Googled it, right? Like, if you typed in that very question, there's multiple books that would have popped up. And I was like, here's a convenient video of Monica Coleman and I answering this question. You're more than welcome when you'll look and say to yourself, this is a womanist process theologian.
I do think there's one aspect of that that might have caught this person's attention, and that is if you're an open and relational process person and you believe God's a liberator, which you and I both do, you're not going to think that God's going to do it single handed. You're not going to think that you just sit on your butt and God's just going to fix everything with a snap of a finger. But yeah, so if that's what they mean, that you can't be process and liberation, well, you just got a view of God that doesn't fit the world in which we live.
Yeah. Well, also, just how okay, if that's how it works, if it gets to a finger snap, what's the death count have to be before the God of love snaps a finger? Right? Like,
Exactly.
don't
Yeah.
you wonder? Like, I just sit there and think to myself, come on. Like, and at what point here I I I was on another podcast recently, and I apparently said in it, I'd rather be an atheist than be a Calvinist. It is kind of true. But I was a Calvinist, so, like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I get you.
But and it was responding to, the whole, like, how if you are in a particular place, then the whole logic of it just seems normal. And like all of a sudden I was asking certain questions that then made me go, I find God morally problematic here, but I'm totally comfortable. Like I'm comfortable with Jesus's moral outlook. Jesus even learns from a woman that interrupts him. God, on the other hand, is like, before the foundation of the earth, I'm like, do you know how you demonstrate your holy love? Reprobate. I'm like, and I remember running interference for that idea, going, yeah, but I mean, if God saves one, right? And so I feel like there is this sense of, that's why I always try to engage kindly, because I was definitely that person until I wasn't, I read Spurgeon sermons for devotionals. And now I'm like, I don't even know if I could worship that God. And now I'm not personally, just in case Calvin's right, I'm not saying I want to volunteer for hell. Like obviously perseverance of the saints. But maybe it's a sign that I was never elected anyway.
I think there is something though. Well, you want to go to the next
ahead.
question?
No.
I think I too was overzealous. I never was a Calvinist, but I was an overzealous person who thought I had the answers. And I think this is actually, John Sanders once did a lecture at a conference and I won't be able to summarize it perfectly, but he basically said this: open and relational theology suggests a particular kind of character, particular kind of virtue, and one of them is humility. And that is, since we have a God who's relational, we don't have it, can't impose this revelation on us. We can't be sure. We don't have certainty. Then that should inspire in us a kind of humility, that if you have a God who could give you the right truth and put it in your head or in the Bible, then maybe you don't have to be so humble.
Well, there's always that. All right, Tom. All right. Two more. Then I'll go to bed. You don't have to. It's much earlier for you. We're 8 hours difference. All right. So a number of people were rather disturbed on the Twitter, and a couple of the process groups about a certain influential Reformed thinker or minister who sometimes passes as a scholar, and he posted some high quality syllogisms.
Okay.
A syllogism, and this was then shared as process takedowns. Now, I have actually no clue when you read this how actually it relates to process theology.
Right. But it's supposed to take it down, huh?
Yeah, but this is though. See, I take the fact that theology Twitter now feels like they have to take a dump on process theology all the time as a compliment. Think of how many people cared about process theology when the podcast started. Like, it was not in vogue at all. Yep. Like, the number of schools that have process theology, seminaries that have process theology classes has tripled in the last 10 years, like as an elective on the books. Yeah. Like, I'm a proselytizer, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and a lot of people get more into it, and I get it, right? Because it's correct. But but because then people like find that, like, hear it, and then they're like, oh, this is bad. Then they like tweet this at you, and apparently it got people signal. So I really hope you're prepared for a syllogism that's going to blow your mind. It's going to blow your mind, Tom. Premise 1: all knowledge. Now, you may say to yourself, this is Tripp's parenthetical comment. Like, when you write a premise that says all knowledge, are you uncomfortable? Because I am. That's anyway. All knowledge, even scientific, begins with faith.
Okay.
Okay.
What kind of faith?
Well,
General or Christian faith, or you
well,
can't have certainty?
Tom, the ambiguity in what the word faith in these three syllogisms is doing
Okay.
is kind of part of its evangelism. All right.
So I got the first premise. All knowledge, even scientific knowledge, begins or is based on faith.
Begins with faith. Yeah, because no one has access to the whole, all complete knowledge. Other than Laplace's demon and the holy sweet Jesus. Therefore, it involves some type of faith because you have to trust some other, right? And then you have to trust some other, and that the world is structured in a way that it's available, right? So
sounds like we're denying a priori truths.
Oh,
like
Tom,
2 + 2 is 4, and married bachelors.
but you have to come to those conclusions, and those conclusions involve the assumption that the universe is understandable, which gateway to the Trinity. Anyway,
all right.
Premise 2: efforts for a completely objective knowledge end in complete subjectivism, despairing of truth.
Efforts for a completely objective knowledge end in subjectivism, despairing of truth.
It's the use of the word complete here really creeps me out.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a good question. How many scientists, and I spend time with scientists, how many scientists, if you said, hey, are you trying to figure out the world? They'd say, yeah. Are you trying to have complete objective knowledge of all things? Like that. Only a philosopher that wants to debate complete objective knowledge of all things has that as a task.
That's right, a straw man.
You know what I mean? Like, it's one of those. To me that like this is when I get triggered. When I see complete objective knowledge end in complete subjectivism, despairing of truth. Once someone says complete objective knowledge, I'm already suspicious. But Tom, I probably read too much Nietzsche and Freud that as probably was my gateway drug into complete subjectivism, despairing of truth.
Let me ask you this. Do you think the person who tweets this think there's something like complete objective truth? Or do you think this person is trying to say it's all subjective?
Well, I'm going to go ahead and guess that very influential Reformed thinkers do not pull a Kierkegaard.
That's probably right.
Because, like, if you said to me, like, invent the third premise 1, if you were like, invent the next premise, right? Like, all knowledge, even scientific one, begins with faith. Like, if I'm just reading it generously, I'm like, yeah. So, like, there's always the approximation of the whole where any particular type of advance of knowledge is necessary. And so, but then you have to, I don't know, like an airplane, take off, do your construction, land, and then reevaluate, aka the beginning of process of reality. Right? It's called speculative metaphysics. But then if premise 2 is like efforts for a completely objective knowledge into complete subjectivism, despairing of truth, then I would think, as a process person, 2 things. 1, desires for complete objective knowledge already bifurcate nature and misses that it's inherently subjective, because all things have their own internal experience that you only have access to your own. So the desire to objectively know it is to deny the reality of the life within. Hashtag modes of thought, nature alive, nature dead. But I mean, the other side of the desire for complete objective knowledge into complete subjectivism, that's one of those where you go, I know no scientist really wants complete objective knowledge. They're just trying to figure things out. But I do. So I'm going to pretend that's what they want, and then footnote a few of their crazies, like the angry atheists, right? And then pretend that's what they all want, so that I can say, like, no. Your postmodern, post-structuralist types are really right. It's all subjective. You don't even get science without faith, Tom. You don't get science without faith. You know what that must mean?
So
Premise 3. These dots are connected, Tom.
okay.
Faith in God and his revelation is necessary for proper epistemic confidence. Did you know that God has to have a penis for you to have proper epistemic confidence? Because this does. Like, it was if by God here you mean that there's a unity of knowledge that's internally consistent and knowable, given the structures of human knowing in our flux in time, and I'm calling that God, that's one thing. If all of a sudden,
I doubt that's what this person.
well, given that God has a gender and it was labeled revelation, is necessary, right? So
for epistemic, what was the last
for
word?
proper epistemic confidence, we're not talking about your loosey goosey
Wow.
like a relativist confidence.
Those three, so obviously this is not it's not a real argument, but if you just look at those three,
Obviously.
If you just look at those three statements, there's so much going on there, and their interpretive range is so wide. Wow. Okay. Sorry. I don't understand what this has to do with process either.
No, because obviously process doesn't really. Well, Twitter has said it was a takedown. So.
Oh, okay. Well, that settles it then.
Like, we just don't have proper faith in God, and so I had a few follow-ups. Never quite understood how this one worked. I then took a screen grab of it and texted it to my Reformed friends. Their explanations didn't help. It only increased my suspicion. But I do think, I'll put it this way: do not reference. You don't have to reference these powerful, probably conscience-changing theses. But how would you describe, in an open relational perspective, the traditional kind of distinction in knowledge, like subjective and objective knowledge? And then how does a process relational framework help you think of the quest for truth, both in the religious, theological type of sphere, all the way up to, big picture science and such?
Wow, that's a great question. I'm going to take some stabs at it, and then you add your stuff. I think an open relational person believes there is objective truth. Mm-hmm. Everything that happens moment by moment becomes a fact. There are facts that have occurred because history occurs, and every single moment something new happens. So it's not a sort of a relativism, extreme relativism that says anything goes, there's no facts. There really are facts. There's also, in open relational thought, the notion that there's what we'll call metaphysical truths that aren't dependent upon us knowing them. The problem is that nobody can get their head around all those metaphysical truths unless you believe, like I do, in a God. So God knows all metaphysical truths, knows everything that has happened, is happening, and could happen. So there is one mind capable of objective truth, but even that mind is adding new truths to it moment by moment. So it's not some sort of settled thing. So then adding on to that, the idea that we can't know things with certainty because we don't have a complete knowledge of any single fact. And we don't have a God who can guarantee that knowledge gets stuck in our head. I think an open and relational person is probably committed to something like a realist perspective that says there are objective truths in reality, but we can't know them all or get our heads around them entirely. So sometimes it's called critical realism. It's got a bunch of different names. How would you respond?
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. I mean, I think the two things that stick out to me when I encounter people who have that kind of response to, what do you do with truth and knowledge, and how can you even talk about anything, and what's the viability of God's statement? Like, underneath that, I would just say The case for a spiritual dimension is something that must be taken seriously, is not a series of analytical philosophical arguments. Right? Because I have taught, and you have as well, the proofs for God's existence are ongoing interpretation. And you want to know the number of students that have changed their mind about the reality of God because of high quality presentations, either for or against? I'm at zero, Tom. I'm at zero. And honestly, like, I really think every time I get to do the ontological argument, I kind of do it Hartshorn style, but I feel like it's a passionate articulation. And on my best days, I get, now, I don't really believe in God, but if I was going to, that's like a pretty good version. Or, well, I already believed in God, I didn't know why.
Yeah.
And I'll stick with that. So, like, the desire for knowledge that then compel, right, proper faith in God or whatever that is, I think misses the point. I think if you're an open and relational perspective, thinking about like how you would make a case for the spiritual dimension, it would be much more something like the lived experience of each person and across cultures is something that when you encounter an other, there is a demand that is not just recognition of the reality, but recognition of their value. And you can take something like big horrors to deep joys, and all of those, what's demanded from that relationship is more than the acknowledgement that they exist. It's acknowledgement of value. And religious traditions thematize it in all sorts of different ways, like in a lot of your work looking into like the concept of love across religious traditions.
Right.
You can see how it shows up in different cultures. But if you take all that, and then I would say, let's even look at, say, the way in which people that don't even acknowledge God acknowledge the way the other or Gaia, or I mean, there's lots of different ways, right? Really,
Yeah.
the face metaphorically that demands a value, evaluation, and it comes with demands upon you. That features ubiquitous across cultures. And if I was trying to make a case for the spiritual dimension to then go, my particular tradition has something to contribute to it, I would say we suck in the quest for complete objective knowledge of everything and giving an account of robust value, meaning, and purpose. And yet humans keep doing it. And here's examples across cultures, and here's examples in places that technically affirm your kind of like narrow materialist logic that, you know, are counterexamples. This to me, that feature of existence, the depth dimension that it entails valuation or aesthetic judgment, when you look at different cultures talking about it, to me, that's similar to how, say, Pythagoras, Aristotle, Newton, and Einstein all have internally consistent accounts of the experience of what we call gravity. Right. So they are not mathematically coherent in the sense of compatible across the language system of those mathematical accounts of a particular phenomena, but they all have internally consistent accounts of a phenomena we call gravity. And I would say something like God or the spiritual dimension is like that a multiplicity of cultures have cultivated a series of symbols and signs that point towards the depth dimension. So God and gravity are similar. We in the West say God and gravity, but it's not like they're, you know, final, but it's pointing to something. But then if you ask me as a Christian, my proper confidence, which is the line in the thing, is not because those conclusions are demanded, but because the conclusions as a person of faith are demanding upon me to live a life of love, to invite me into canonic living. And then what's compelling is the life of Francis or Teresa or King, like, you know, the life of individuals and the life of communities who embody this way of being in the world. And what is it resonating with? It's not resonating with epistemic demands of objective certainty. It's resonating with that depth dimension, like God and with the God and gravity thing. It goes, oh, that's so beautiful. It might be true. And I feel like we we're so too many Christians wish that their minister was as obnoxious and confident as Richard Dawkins. We don't need one. We just don't. Like that was like the compelling thing about the gospel is that communities that take it seriously choose the well-being of their neighbor and their enemies when it makes no sense, and then celebrate most deeply those that do. That's compelling. Like I don't it has, and that's not a rational argument. But as a philosopher of religion, I would do the God gravity comparison, just go like,
Yeah, I
that's a
like that
spiritual dimension.
analogy. Yeah, I like that analogy a lot. You took it a lot different direction than I did. I like what you said. Um, my mind started going down the path of why don't analytic theologians use the kind of argument you just gave? Like, I've given papers at analytic theology conferences and hanging out with those folks, and a lot of good things are done, got a lot of good people. They tend to start with the thing they want to defend and then use analytic theology to defend it. But you wouldn't have to take that strategy. So let's take what you just said about values. Could an analytic thinker not prove the existence of God, but provide a case, make a case, give an argument for why belief in God is plausible based on the value claims
Mm-hmm.
people across times and centuries have had? I mean, Kant kind of does that with the moral argument, but I don't know that a lot of people are making that kind of an argument in the analytic circle, but it could be made. What do you think?
I I don't know the closest when that whole trajectory popped in my head um was, and she's been on the podcast, Fiona Ellis,
Oh
um
yeah, yeah.
and she develops this argument from desire, and like in the philosophical sense, not like desire in the other sense, with Levinas. And then um William Greenway, in he had a recent book. I'm writing a review on it, and he picks that up and engages Spavink's book. I can't, oh, what was the name of it? Okay, Spavink, post-colonial theorist, who wrote a book, and I don't remember the name, and I wasn't planning on talking about this, or I'd remember it, but where the first half of the book is doing the post-colonialist history, looking at like with the type of genealogy moves post Foucault and such. Second half is like, here's the moral demands this makes, and she very specifically says, like, I don't there's not a justification for this, it just should be the case,
Huh.
and 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 the way she divides the book is one where it's like there are these two, in language I use a lot, registers, right, that are getting itself done, and the theory in a that it presumes a kind of reductive materialism doesn't have a intellectual public discourse for the ethical demands that post-colonial there's like the analysis of,
Oh,
right,
I
you
see.
can do
Hmm.
from the genealogical moves of the history, but then there's like, what is the ethical demands after the
Yeah, where's the
post-colonial move,
ought?
and that
Yeah.
needs this other register. And Greenway's essay kind of dealing with it, and I read it after I just taught the like uh a number of Spivak articles. I was like, this is brilliant, and then I started thinking, like, what was it that for Whitehead occasioned the reintroduction of God? It was uh aesthetics, and it was valuation.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
um and so, like, with that frame, I was started reprocessing in my head what he does in Religion in the Making, and that was kind of the origins of the process
Yeah.
version of God and gravity analogy.
Yeah.
That,
Yeah.
but I haven't worked it out loud before, so that was first.
Well, I
I got
think you could. I think a Whiteheadian could also, again, arguments for God is not the right word. Make a plausible case for the existence of God beyond
yeah.
value, uh, by making arguments about purpose,
Hmm.
order, Those are kind of more traditional. You'll hear more of those in a different way. It's spun out differently. Um, but I think you're right. The valuation is probably the most important. It's the most important for me because of the love stuff.
Yeah.
But I think it's the most important for Whitehead, based the way he thinks about all the kinds of issues you've already mentioned: beauty, perception is feeling,
Hmm.
um, novelty, etc. Anyway,
Well,
the,
and because of the the premises in the tweet, it was about epistemology, and I just feel like part of what that trick is doing is right, like hyperbolize scientists to say they want
yeah,
everything objective, then be like the deconstructionists are right, it's all subjective. So
yeah,
therefore, the act of trust required in science correlates to the act of trust for a religious conviction. I'm like, they're not related at all. But
I know.
if you're just trying to justify, in a sense, or recognize philosophically a depth dimension or spiritual dimension, like I would just take a different tactic altogether. But I feel like a lot of conservative people intellectually are just jealous of science, and so they feel like they have to justify everything. They want it to be like on the same tier, and then I'm like,
Yeah.
it's not. It's just not the same. They're different, but
Reminds me of back when I was a student at Claremont. David Reed Griffin was my advisor. He came up with some writings on reformed epistemology, which is a phrase that your listeners might know. It's a way of looking at knowledge that was, and the particular phrase was coined by Alvin Flanagan and Nicholas Wolterstorff. And Griffin, he leans analytic. So, this is something that sort of was right in his wheelhouse. And basically, his criticism was Reformed epistemology presupposes a particular view of God. If you put in a different view of God, you could have you wouldn't call it Reformed probably epistemology, but you could make a lot of the same moves that they made. It's just you would have very different outcomes. Anyway, we're
yeah.
going down rabbit trails now. But
All right. One more question. What are the 5 best reasons not to be an open and relational theologian?
what are the 5 best
Like
reasons
when you
to
hear them,
reject?
yeah, when you hear them, you're like, all right, I guess.
Yeah.
Not when you hear them, you're like, are we really doing the evolving God bit again?
Yeah, like the strongest criticism of open relation. I think one criticism that has strength for some people, and we've already been kind of talking about this, is um, if you really want to have the security you find in certainty, you're not going to get it from open relational thinkers. Some make some pretty strong claims about who God is, but if they're most of them are not certain about that, and open relational God doesn't give you the kind of security that an omnipotent God can give you, even though you end up living your life the same, and people who believe in that classical God are hurt just as often as open relational people. They don't have the psychological security. So there'd be one. What do you got?
Mhm. Um. Well, okay. Um. If you, an open relational theism tend to emphasize love such that quite a few of atonement theories are completely off the table.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if the character of God and the disposition of the Son are ever in conflict, then it's kind of off the table. So, like penal substitutionary atonement, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if your theology needs human beings to be the center of the cosmos and God's eternal, infinite, deepest desire, wrong theology. Now, obviously, I think that if that's your desire, the 16th century is welcoming you back. But, you know, like I do think there's a type of anthropocentrism that's problematic. If
I got one. Oh,
Go for
sorry.
it. Oh no, if the central feature of your theology is the individual and not the community, wrong
Mhm.
theology.
Yeah.
Um,
If you think Science, philosophy, and theology should all be kept neatly separated in their own little boxes, such that they never talk to each other or influence one another. You're probably not going to be an open relation
Mhm.
person.
Also, never met an open relational theologian that likes Nickelback. So if you don't like Nickelback, you're welcome.
Here's something I say in the book. This is number 6, I guess now. Maybe you can correct me. I have yet to meet an open and relational person who believes in the traditional view of hell. It's possible theoretically,
I
but I just
guess
never run across one. Uh, so
that's. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, like if someone said they did, but
yeah.
also, what is a traditional view of hell? But
All right, maybe I should say
a
internal conscious torment.
nightmare from the medieval period.
Yeah.
Like, dude, that is funny, right? Like, that's a funny aside, but I would just say, if you're an open relational theologian, then you recognize the situatedness of all events, but also that God's present in them. So then you look at the past and go, like, what was trying to get itself done in this that was beautiful, and then what behind do we need to leave behind? And and I think, like, like something like hell is one that if you're an open relational person and then you're looking at our contemporary context and setting, it's like what is this? This isn't something that's contributing to human flourishing or fidelity among the people of God in any deep way. It actually creates relational patterns of codependency and fear. Like how the doctrine functions post Christendom is probably different than it did in the past. Like, I read some mystics and I'm like, I get what you're saying, but I'm still just creeped out by the fact that you visited hell, you know? And because it may have functioned in more life-giving places in the past, but where we are now, so that doctrine involves convincing someone up front, unless you grew up in a context where this is true, but for most people, like convincing them they have a eternal soul that's going to send sometime somewhere. There's 2 locations and God has it out for them. Like, all that is a lot of work. And then, like, you think of Jesus and he's like, the kingdom of God is among you. And like, less like God takes sides with the least of these. And like, there,
Yeah.
like, so much of what Jesus is inviting you into is unrelated to a fear you don't cognitively have. Right. And so if I'm thinking as a process person and I'm thinking about the energy that would be required and the closure of relationships necessary to put them in a universe where that fear is still viable, not helpful. Let's
Yeah.
put our
Yeah.
effort into it dealing with other things that, I don't know, Jesus spent much more time talking about. And
I got another one. Another one came to mind as you were talking.
all right.
I'm not sure this is a, well, I'll just lay it out. Maybe you can characterize it well. When I was writing this new book on open and relational thought, I realized that there were some in the open and relational camp that really strongly emphasize the free will argument. The individuals make free will decisions moment by moment. There are others in the process of the open relational camp that really emphasize the communal part, where relation involved, etc. But none of them kind of go to what I think are extremes. The folks who have the free will side and really want to emphasize that and say we're not predestined, predetermined, whatever, by God above or the atoms below. None of them that I know of, at least, go so far as to say we're free to do anything. So
Mm-hmm.
this absolute freedom, like, I can do whatever, be whatever you want to be. None of them go that far. On the other side, the folks who really emphasize the communal, relational, social aspects, as far as I know, none of them go so far as to say, and you're entirely determined by your relations, entirely determined by your environment. Both, they may sort of stretch on a spectrum, but neither of them go so far as to eliminate the others. I don't know what you call that, Tripp. something open to relational theologians emphasize both relations and freedom. So the opposite would be if you really don't like either one. I don't know.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's important. It's also we didn't get to one of them, but like someone was just like, you can't be processed because liberty and freedom's whack, and I was just like, have you, well, I don't even know a process person is obsessed with liberty and freedom. I
Libertarian, you mean?
no, like complete
Liberty.
freedom for the person. Like
Oh,
you're
gotcha.
always
Yeah.
embedded, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
Whitehead was like, the striking thing is that something isn't determined, right?
Right.
It's a like it's the occasion of freedom that raises the question of novelty, not the
Yes.
completeness of freedom that determines one's anthropology. And I think a lot of because people, especially if you think problem of evil, go process is like more hardcore free will theism, then they must think like we think you're even more free. And I'm like, I mean, like I think people
Yeah.
like exaggerate freedom just
Yes.
to get God off the hook so they can keep a less than optimal vision of God.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I mean, if you put one way, like an open relational theologian, like recognizes that there were like, at least on our planet, 13 billion years before anything approximating like
Right.
deeply responsive subjectivity emerged. Like God was
Yeah.
rather invested in a deep way. And so the idea that like behind that, God's like I need a like that whole like, complete freedom thing sounds more like dualism, where
Yeah.
you got like the mechanisms all running around, and once you put that special soul in a body, then all of a
Yeah.
sudden we're exempt from things.
Yeah.
So um you the other like good reason that uh to not be an
Open and
open
relation.
relational theologian, this is the best one, Tom.
Okay.
Yeah, you're an obnoxious asshole. Don't be an open and relational theologian. The other day, I I should not have spent time on Twitter. Because I knew we were going to do this, I started to engage, and I went back and deleted my comments. And I've decided, like, why am I trying to convince someone who spent zero effort to understand process thought that their understanding is wrong? Like, do we really want them on our team? It's probably better that they like keep running around
Uh,
quoting Plantiga at people, and then people are like, I don't want that. Oh, if you, if if your friends say that you're trying, you know, that you're not like the first invite to a party, you're the last because they feel obligated. Like maybe don't be an open relational theologian.
well, I think there's something to that. I mean, I know some open relational people who have who need to learn more kindness. So it's not like everybody is perfect or loving and everything. But generally speaking, I do think that people in the open and relational crowd tend to be kinder, more empathetic, tend to be more positive, socially engaged. Um, and we only have to look at one of our heroes, John Cobb. What is he, 96 years old? Just what a loving gentleman. He's been a great role model. But it's more than just being a role model. I think the theology itself, it doesn't make you kind, but it inclines you to see the value of love. Um, and so, if that's your vision of God, and we all consciously or unconsciously imitate what we think is ultimate, then I think you're going to be more inclined to be a loving person.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's really helpful. Like earlier today, we had some very serious issues with British Airways that occupied basically 3.5 hours of Alicia and I's
uh,
afternoon, which led to us being rather irritated. Then, like, you throw all that on top of the fact that we've been in lockdown in a country where we don't have friends. So, like, all the regret of being here lines up. Then
yeah,
we can't even get back to go to a family member's wedding. Like,
yeah,
they're like, oh, we've canceled your flight. Like, all this is going on, right? And then kids get home, and I don't remember exactly what happened, but I said something and I could see the kids' faces, or they were like, "What in the world just came out of Dad's mouth?" And I'm like, "What? What's wrong? And they were like, Dad, uh, are you yelling? And I was like, oh, yeah, it wasn't about you. And I start to like explain, I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm really sorry. Like, Mom, I'm real frustrated. We both been on the phone for multiple hours trying to and I start to explain it, and and Elgin goes, a lot of people don't apologize like this, Dad. And he goes like, I get it, it's fine. And I was like, yeah, I know. I like, you don't deserve that. And he's like, his sister, brother, little brother walk away. He's like, Dad, why do you like when you realize you were doing something dumb or whatever, like, why do you try to like really apologize a lot right then? And and I was like, that's a weird question. I mean, he's 13, right? So
Yeah.
he's always interested in what animates you. And
Yeah.
I said, I don't know, like if you think I'm always contributing to God's life,
Mm.
and then because you were honest enough in the way you responded to what I was saying to realize like I was being an idiot, I could just
Yeah.
intervene, change directions, and try to apologize and I'm probably still going to be in a bad mood the rest of the day.
Yeah.
But
Well, that's an important feature to include here, and that is, we have real emotions. It's
yeah,
not like, we're not going to be frustrated, angry, pissed off. That's part of life. It's just how we decide to deal with it. Obviously, that's anyway.
but it was funny. Like I wasn't like sitting there going like this is a process moment. Like when
Right.
you and maybe there's no chance I'm getting to 97, but like if I was because of scientific advance, um,
Yeah.
like I would hope that whole framing of like every moment, like the more you're attentive and contribute to the
Yeah.
well-being of the whole, you're joining God and having God's dream come about.
Yeah.
But that's the only thing you're in charge of. So like do a good job with that. So
Yeah.
often, especially the nerds, right? You want to understand everything. So you figure out the sociology, the economics, the politics, the cultural, blah, 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 blah. And then you fail to just show up in the best way you can to those around you. And I
Yeah.
regularly have that. Like this is more of a confessional than a hi
Yeah.
friends, be like Trip moment. But it's more like a be like John Cobb moment. Like where, does that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
I I think a lot of the process perspectives of me, it's like, yeah, care about those big things, try to learn about it, do your best, encourage people, help people have better understanding, do what you can with the podcast and your books and all blah 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 blah. But also, like the only thing that gets shared to the next moment is what you give to it.
Yeah.
Like what's the way you use the language about like uh about love and what it is you want to do? I always find that it's really beautiful. You're like,
Well, I always say I want to live a life of love. Um, I'm starting to say this because people ask me about my photography a lot and my books and things. And I say, I care about art, I care about beauty, but I want my life to be my primary art object, you might say. I want to live a life of love, and that's what to me matters most. And which is, some people say, well, you know, well, I'll just put it this way: open and relational theology provides the best overall framework to make sense of not only my intuitions of love, but the kind of love I want to live throughout a lifetime. And that's the primary reason I'm an open relational thinker. There's lots of reasons to be, and I've got other reasons on the table, but that's the primary.
mhm, awesome. Well, see, that wasn't too painful.
That was fun. That was fun with you. I enjoy laughing with you and talking theology.
And remind everyone, when's the new book come out?
1st of July.
All right.
And I'm trying to set this all up so that the 1st of July, you can get an ebook, paperback, hardback, and audio. Boom, lay it all
Ooh,
in there.
that's impressive.
Yeah. I do my best.
All right.